Work is copyrighted 1999 by Eric Larson. This recording is copyrighted 2000 by Recorded Books. In the spring of 2000, as Isaac's Storm maintained its steady position on bestsellers lists, author Eric Larson stepped into a studio in his hometown of Seattle in order to talk with us a while about the writing of the book. You will find that interview at the end of the program. Eric Larson is a frequent contributor to many national magazines and the author of 2 previous books. His subtitle for Isaac's Storm aptly describes his latest offering: A Man, a Time, and the Deadliest Hurricane in History. At the dawn of the 20th century, a great confidence suffused America. Isaac Klein was one of the era's new men, a scientist who believed he knew all there was to know about the motion of clouds and the behavior of storms. The idea that a hurricane could damage his hometown of Galveston, Texas, was to him preposterous. It was 1900, a year when America felt bigger and stronger than ever before. Nothing in nature could hobble the gleaming city, a magical place that seemed destined to become the New York of the Gulf. That August, a strange, prolonged heat wave gripped the nation and killed scores of people in New York and Chicago. Odd things happened. A plague of crickets engulfed Waco. The Bering Glacier began to shrink. Rain fell on Galveston with a greater intensity than anyone could remember. Far away in Africa, immense thunderstorms blossomed over the city of Dakar, and great currents of wind converged. A wave of atmospheric turbulence slipped from the coast of western Africa. Most such waves faded quickly. This one did not. And now, Isaac's Storm.
Telegram. Part 5. Strange News.
The End. You've been listening to Isaac's Storm by Eric Larson, narrated by Richard M. Davidson. While Isaac's Storm was in production at the studios of Recorded Books, we had a chance to talk with author Eric Larson about the writing of the book. You'll find that interview on the final cassette. If you've enjoyed this book and this performance, Recorded Books recommends Fire on Earth, Doomsday, Dinosaurs, and Mankind by John and Mary Gribben, also narrated by Richard M. Davidson, and My Old Man and the Sea by David Hayes and Daniel Hayes, narrated by George Guedel and Jeff Woodman. You'll find a wide selection of titles in the Recorded Books catalog, including bestsellers, mysteries, classics, histories, and more. So to order another recorded book, or for a copy of our latest listing, please call us using the telephone number on the back of the book. You can order by phone with any major credit card, or by writing to us, or by faxing us. Don't forget to ask about easy 30-day rentals by mail. On our website, you can browse the catalog, hear about the latest releases, place orders, or tune into narrator profiles and author interviews. So visit us there at www.recordedbooks.com. And thank you for being a Recorded Books reader. Recorded Books Incorporated presents The Author Talks, a conversation with Eric Larson. In the spring of 2000, just as the recording of Isaac's Storm was being completed, author Eric Larson stepped into a recording studio in his hometown of Seattle to talk a while with staffer Denise Langto about the creation of the book.
Today from the Manhattan studios of Recorded Books, we're speaking with best-selling author Eric Larson from his hometown in Seattle. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you.
Today we'll be learning about the story behind the story of your wonderful book, Isaac's Storm. Could you begin by telling our listeners how you came upon this particular event in history and decided to write a book about it?
Well, first of all, it was a complete accident that I even came across this hurricane, although I am a hostile weather junkie, and I do love/hate hurricanes, and grew up on Long Island in sort of the northern cusp of the hurricane belt. But I came across this one by accident. I was working on a very different project about a murder in New York in the year 1900. And it was a murder where the victim was a man named William Marsh Rice. William Marsh Rice being the guy whose money founded Rice University. At this point, though, he was living in Manhattan. And he lived in Manhattan with a valet. At that point, Mr. Rice was quite old. Into their lives came an unscrupulous attorney from Houston. And the valet and the attorney began plotting to kill Mr. Rice. Now, stay with me here, because this does lead to a hurricane. They began plotting to kill Mr. Rice slowly using arsenic, and then they were going to fake a will and get all his money. Well, along came a hurricane, and at this point in my research into that project, I only knew it as a hurricane, not as the mother of all hurricanes. Along came a hurricane, and it destroyed a lot of Mr. Rice's possessions and factories and so forth in the Galveston-Houston area. He got very depressed. He was getting ready to send all his New York liquid savings to Texas, which, of course, for the plotters would not have been very good. So they stepped up their plot and killed him, increased the dose of arsenic. And in so doing, that hurricane became probably the first hurricane in history to be really implicated in a first-degree homicide. But the more I read about the hurricane, the more intrigued I became. I mean, this was a storm that, the first headline I saw when I started reading about the hurricane said that there were 3,000 to 4,000 dead. And I thought that was an exaggeration. I figured that was just the yellow journalism of the time. The more I got into it, I realized that was an underestimate, gross underestimate. The most widely accepted and perhaps most realistic death toll being about 10,000 people in Galveston alone. And so instantly I was hooked.
Well, once you were hooked, how difficult was it writing the story? And did you know from the onset that it would be Isaac's storm that you would be centering on, or were you going to tell the human story and then you sort of stumbled upon him as your unwitting protagonist?
Well, the thing that attracted me first to the hurricane was simply the fact that I hadn't known anything about it. But also because a hurricane, when you think about it, a hurricane has a terrific narrative structure. It's got a very novelistic structure. You have a huge cataclysm that begins in far-off places with small effects that gradually gain energy and power. You've got winds that grow, you've got clouds that grow, you've got thunder and lightning, everything that makes a good novel. And you have it all accelerating toward a peak. And, it's sort of a classic narrative arc. And the climax, of course, is when the storm actually arrives. And I was always very, very acutely tuned to that kind of narrative arc because, again, as a kid growing up on Long Island, one of the most exciting and scary things was when a hurricane was approaching Long Island, and you'd listen to it for days, tracking it on the radio. And then when it finally came, it was terrifying, but it was the ramp up to that in many ways was the most terrifying of all, knowing that this giant thing was coming. So right away there was a real narrative attraction to the hurricane. However, I also knew that was not enough because, you can write about a disaster, but if you don't do it in a way that has what I call emotional traction, you can make it compelling, but it's not going to make you cry. It's not going to make you really think about the disaster in human terms. When I say emotional traction, I talk about that power of certain works to really make you feel something on an emotional level. Contrast, there was a book done called A Night to Remember by Walter Lord about the Titanic disaster. Very good book, very compelling. But really a series of vignettes and episodes strung together with no one main character or two running through the whole thing. Contrast that with the movie Titanic, where, there was admittedly a fictional story superimposed over a really terrific factual base. But contrast the effect of the two. A Night to Remember, you read it and you're fascinated, and in the end it's a pretty satisfying read, but emotionally not that powerful. The movie Titanic, I don't know about anybody else, but it changed forever the way I will view the Titanic disaster. And that's because of the characters that the directors allowed us to follow through the story. And I think that was very important. So I resolved that if I'm going to do a book about a hurricane, about a disaster, I won't do it unless I can find one or two characters to follow through the storm, people we can hold hands with as the storm accelerates.
Now, in the real-life event, was Isaac central to the story after the hurricane?
What do you mean central after the hurricane?
Well, I mean, did people in the area know about him and wonder, why he didn't do this or that? I know there was the whole business with the Weather Bureau and saying that, they'd said hurricane flags should be put up and they told lies and whatnot. But did people go to him and talk to him about the storm? Was he sort of a central focus of it from there on in?
The historical record is relatively mute on what happened with regard to Isaac as far as how the public viewed him. I think people saw him fundamentally as a very tragic figure. I mean, he had lost a wife and nearly lost his whole family, and one of his daughters was quite seriously injured. But I think people also wanted to, for whatever reason, wanted to see him as a hero. I don't think he was really roundly criticized by other inhabitants of Galveston. It was outsiders in Houston and elsewhere who wondered about the role of the Weather Service, not just him, but about the Weather Service as a whole, and just how efficiently they had predicted this thing, whether they had actually lived up to the skills that they believed they had.
Now, clearly to write a book like Isaac Storm, there's a great deal of painstaking research involved, and our listeners haven't had the opportunity to see your footnotes and your voluminous source references in the book. So can you give them a sense of the task that you faced when you began your research for this book?
Yeah, one of the things that I found very interesting in terms of the reception I got from readers was, and it was kind of disturbing actually, was an assumption that a good part of the book was made up or was fictionalized. And it certainly was not. For example, anything within quotes was either said or written or otherwise conveyed in some written format, and I simply put quotes around it. Perhaps it was a letter, perhaps it was an interview in a newspaper, perhaps it was a memorandum, official correspondence of Isaac Klein, that kind of thing. The task was, well, on one hand, very, very satisfying. I love sort of ferreting out interesting little details from the past. Maybe I'm a boring guy, but I love libraries. I mean, that to me, I can spend 12 hours in a library if I'm looking for something particular, and it's kind of like hunting a fugitive through the pages of history. I really enjoy it. Luckily, in the case of the storm, there was a lot of stuff to mine. In Galveston, there is the Rosenberg Library, which has a terrific storm archive, full of personal accounts, full of little bits and details, full of photographs, all of which kind of helped me piece together the saga of the storm. Surprisingly, there was not much in the Rosenberg archives on Isaac Klein himself. I had to dig that stuff out from other sources, particularly the National Archives in Silver Spring, Maryland, the National Archives Annex. But it was terrific fun. I found a lot of first-person narratives that had been contributed to the Rosenberg Library, which were fabulous in terms of telling what the effects of the storm were, how the storm arrived. And when you put those together with other sources, for example, an incredibly detailed fire insurance map of Galveston, which told not only where houses were, but also kind of showed what their shape was on the map, and also told you what they were made of, what the roof was made of, where the kitchen was, and all that stuff, was tremendous detail, but it also helped me figure out where individual people lived. For example, I knew that Isaac Klein lived at 25th and Q because of, well, for a number of reasons, but mainly because of the city directory for 1899, the year before the storm, which told me where he lived. But it also told me where other people, other key characters in the book lived. And so putting that together with this very detailed insurance map, I was able to put some things together, like who lived near Isaac, who could he see each day going to work, who could see his house, things like that, which really helped bring history alive. And that's where I think it becomes the most fun.
Well, it certainly is satisfying, I know, for me as a reader, and I'm sure for our listeners. The detail, it was like pieces of gold. There was one particular image of a train coming after the hurricane had struck, and they saw an abandoned children's rocker and nearby a stranded ship. Now, did you see a photograph to get that image? It was so extraordinary.
No, but what was interesting there, though, is that, well, first of all, one has to have driven the Texas prairie between Houston and Galveston to get a sense, first of all, what the land is like now, and then to extrapolate what it must have been like then. But secondly, there were a number of accounts of that very train journey. And when you put them all together, when you triangulate, you get a very detailed, very rich picture of what it was like to be on that train. The children's rocking horse was observed by one of the people who wrote those accounts. The ship and its presence high and dry, well, high and almost dry at that point, on land, was recounted by numerous people who had survived the storm. So when you put all that stuff together, you can make a very rich portrait of what that train journey was like.
So you really have an interesting journey as a writer and a historian in some regard, in that you kind of go backwards and then construct a movie, essentially, before you can begin to write. You have to see and feel everything before you can write about it.
Well, yeah, and I guess if I depart anywhere from traditional history, from academic history, it is on that level. I'm trying to put pieces together. I'm trying to, in a sense, to animate history. Another example, on the morning of the storm, Isaac Klein is going back into town, and I write that he is smelling freshly planed wood, coal smoke, horses, and coffee. Mm-hmm. And, that might be a point where somebody would say, hey, this guy's making this up. This guy is sort of, dressing up the narrative with stuff that he couldn't possibly know. Well, on the one hand, that's correct. I wasn't there with Isaac Klein, riding with him in that carriage, nor did Isaac Klein say, oh, by the way, this particular morning I smelled wood smoke and so forth on my way into the office. However, when you put a lot of pieces together, first of all, that there was a north wind blowing that morning, that he was riding back to his office against that north wind. Also that Saturday morning is a work day and was very much a work day that morning. Also from the fire insurance map, and actually to call it a map is to do it a disservice. It is a collection of maybe 100 maps, each about the size of a tabletop, all bound in this exquisite leather volume. According to the map, along his route, there were stables. Horses were the vehicle of choice in those days. So, he's going to be smelling horses. I guarantee you that if we all step back in time, to Isaac's time, to Galveston, the first thing we would do is just look at each other and say, what is that smell? And it would be horses. But first of all, he's going against the wind. He smells horses. Along his route, there is a wood planing mill. So he's going to smell that fresh scent of cut wood. And, take that, for example. I mean, we all know what fresh cut wood smells like. And, fresh cut wood smelled the same then as it does now. Nothing changed over time in that respect. Same thing with the coffee roastery. There was a bulk coffee roastery along his path. And roasting coffee smelled just as good then as now. And we also know that in the harbor, as the storm was approaching, many ships fired up their coal-fired boilers, because that would help them hold their positions in the dock and allow them to maneuver if they absolutely had to. And, north wind blowing south across the city, heavy plumes of coal smoke would have been drifting over his path. So you can make a pretty good, very articulate, very educated guess about what Isaac Klein was smelling that morning. And I think that's what I bring to the party. I'm not a historian. I am a historical journalist or detective, and that's the stuff that really excites me, is putting those pieces together to try to come up with an animated picture of the past.
It's interesting that you chose the olfactory sense, because I remember that passage, and it was that moment that the story really became alive. And then you pick it up again when, after the disaster, there's the cleanup and there's some semblance of life returning months later. You reestablish the smells again in the air as life somehow returned to order again. And I thought that was interesting in the book.
Yeah, well, to me, one of the things that is missing from history, and is actually missing even often, all too often, frankly, from fiction, is a sense, an acute sense of smell, of what it's like. And, you think about your passage through the average day. Smell is a huge part of what shapes our sense of a day. The smell of flowers in spring, the smell of, the smell of snow. I mean, that may sound strange, but snow has a very distinctive odor to me, or at least what snow does to the landscape. And to leave that stuff out of books does a tremendous disservice. It also helps, I think. I mean, one of the things I'm often asked about is why there are no photographs in the book. And the reason is that, yes, one photograph is worth 1,000 words. But in the case of something like this, they still fall way short of what the experience was really like. For example, with the burning of the corpses afterward. I mean, just try to imagine what that was like. The scent of burning corpses, the ash literally sifting through the sky, and just the sheer horror of going out your back door and seeing neighbors you once exchanged greetings with being thrown into a pile and burned. And this is not something you can capture in a photograph. The only thing I would find in a photograph was a pile of lumber with smoke coming off. That certainly doesn't capture the effect for people who actually live there. So putting things together, putting together the kind of thing that the kind of phenomena that would have to have been happening at that point, I think it draws people. It makes a connection between the past and the present that brings the story alive.
Well, I mean, your narrative is so vivid that there's a constant picture happening anyway, so you can see it as you listen to it or read it. And the one photograph that's on the cover of the book of Isaac Klein, which I didn't realize until the end of the book, was that little diamond ring on his pinky. I thought, what is he wearing that for? And then only to learn later that it was his dead wife's wedding ring.
Right. And, the thing about that photograph is that the one on the cover of the book doesn't even do the photograph justice. It was blown up because of, obviously, it was going to be on the cover. But the photograph itself was taken by a very famous New Orleans photographer, Pop Weitzel, and in its true original form, the blacks are much blacker, the whites much whiter, and it is an incredibly spooky photograph when seen the way it's supposed to be. That's not to take anything from the cover photograph. I love it. I love the cover. I love everything about the book. But there is a darkness to that photograph that is just kind of, after I studied it for a while, kind of sent chills up my spine.
You mean the darkness it captures in Klein's eyes?
A darkness in, not so much in Klein's eyes, but sort of a darkness evokes the darkness of the event, actually, and the tragedy of his loss. I mean, there is just something very romantic, but also very sad about that photograph. And I spent a fair amount of time studying the photograph with a magnifying glass, just kind of looking at it, trying to find details, recognizing that, two important things were at work in this photograph. A, Pop Weitzel was a genius in black and white as a photographer. And Isaac Klein at this point was also quite schooled in American art, in painting, in the use of light and dark, which was a salient feature of art, of painting at that point. So these guys knew what they were doing with this photograph, and I think the effect is very striking.
Whatever became of his 3 daughters?
I have no clue, and that was one of the mysteries of this project. You would expect to find descendants. And indeed, I have heard, since the book was published, I have heard from quite a few descendants of people who have bit parts, if you will, in the book. I heard from one descendant of Louisa Rolfing. I heard most recently from somebody in Robin Hood Bay in England who told me in her letter that this Captain Storm of the Roma was docked there, birthed in Robin Hood Bay, and that the story of his experience in the hurricane was common legend in Robin Hood Bay in England. So to have this storm, have this presence in such a far-off place was fascinating to me. But as for the Klein girls, it is almost as if, I don't know. I mean, I tried to find them in every way I could, including the Internet, which is, of course, you come to believe in magic, and that if you can't do it any other way, certainly the Internet will help you. And it didn't. Couldn't find them. Remember, this is 100 years ago. It's a long time in human spans, and I don't know. I don't know where they are. I heard rumors of a Klein grandchild now in his 70s working in a bank somewhere, who had worked in a bank, but I was unable to find him either. So I was fascinated. I did get a call from one of Joseph Klein's, I believe his great nephew, but he didn't have much to offer. No letters, no documents, just Joe's book and Isaac's book.
one got a sense that Isaac and his brother were really men of their times in terms of not expressing any sort of emotionality. Of course, they were scientists. I mean, you mentioned the book that Isaac wrote about the event, and you said it was very helpful to you in terms of historical fact, but that was about it.
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of like an outline of a life. But that was very important. I mean, it's nice to have an outline and then use these other tools, other artifacts of the time to bring that outline to life. But then there were also other things, Isaac's letters to and from the Weather Bureau, various other things that give you an insight into Isaac and how he thought about things. The fact was, in some ways, that book really did, I think, reflect his personality. I think he was a fairly dry character, no nonsense, something of a sense of humor. But, I felt all along as I was doing this book that I would not want to have worked for Isaac Klein. I don't think that would have been much fun.
What was the single most appealing aspect of Isaac's character?
Well, to me, the most appealing aspect of his character was simply his sense of discipline, his sense of morality. I think he was quite appealingly rigid, not negatively rigid, but appealingly rigid in that respect. I found myself kind of thinking, boy, it'd be nice if more people today had that sort of sense of honor and loyalty and dignity as expressed by him.
Let's talk for a moment about the U.S. Weather Bureau and their rivalry with the Cuban Weather Bureau. The two priests that you mentioned in your book that pioneered and refined the science of hurricane forecasting in Cuba, I just wondered how they ended up being amazing hurricane scientists.
Yeah, well, what happened was that Father Viñas, who was the pioneer of hurricane forecasting and prediction, was, Cuba clearly is and always has been kind of on the railroad tracks in front of endless storms. And they had done so much damage so consistently that Father Viñas made it his goal to try to limit that damage, to try to say, what can we do to try to help people defend against these storms? And he set up an island-wide warning network involving runners and eventually the telegraph, and then in later iterations the telephone, to try to spread the word when interesting phenomena that might forecast the storm began to occur. He was a pioneer in reading the sky for signs of an oncoming storm. He was the guy who first recognized that one of the preceding indicators of a storm are these high, wispy clouds, which he called, pardon my Spanish, rabos de galos, cocktails. He recognized that these things tended to be indicators of an oncoming storm. He recognized also the high deep-sea swells that tended to precede a storm. So in that respect, he really was the pioneer in hurricane detection.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the hubris of the men who ran the U.S. Weather Bureau?
Well, first of all, it was a time nationwide of great hubris. I mean, in 1900, America thought it had everything pretty much wrapped up. It was a time for real profound statements based on very little fact. For example, in that era, one sage said that there would be no oil found west of the Mississippi. Another guy said that there was no longer a need for the patent office because everything that would ever be invented had already been invented. It was that kind of period. And the Weather Service, Isaac included, really reflected this kind of attitude of the time. I mean, I want to state again that, as I have in the past, that Isaac Klein is no villain. Some people have kind of read that into the book. He's no villain. He is simply a creature of his time, as fallible or infallible as anyone, but in a time when people believed that they were infallible. And the hubris of the Weather Service, of the U.S. Weather Bureau, they believed that weather prediction was pretty much a done deal. There were some who even believed that within the next decade or so, men would be able to control the weather. In fact, this was a period when Congress actually funded an experiment to create rain by launching balloons full of dynamite.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. The belief was that there was anecdotal evidence from the French during, I believe it was the Napoleonic Wars, that with heavy artillery bombardment, there tended to be a correlation with rain, which is, of course, subsequently completely disproven. But there was a persistent belief throughout the 19th century that artillery, heavy explosions, you name it, could cause rain. And the Congress funded such an experiment, which, interestingly, according to one study done of that experiment, a very, very sober thing, apparently worked. But, clearly it didn't really work. It was just a confluence of a rain shower and this experiment with balloons full of dynamite. But suffice it to say, the Weather Bureau thought it had things pretty wrapped up and thought it knew all there was to know. And certainly Isaac was the best or worst example of that kind of thing. I mean, one of the things that you asked me about how and why I chose Isaac, and I'm not sure I actually ever really addressed that, but I felt that I really needed to have real characters in this book. And Isaac appeared early on my radar screen, but I dismissed him because he seemed like a fairly unidimensional character. There was a legend of Isaac Klein in Galveston that he had saved thousands of people, and reading his memoir, he certainly accepted that legend and, in fact, amplified that legend. But there's an old saying, show me a hero and I'll show you a tragedy, but there didn't seem to be anything particularly interesting or tragic about Isaac Klein at that point. But it was then, at some point later, that when I was in a library in the NOAA Library, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Library outside Washington, when again, simply by sheer luck, I stumbled across a document. It was a 2-page article by Isaac Klein, in which, and here's where he expressed the hubris of the day, in which he talks about his belief, his certainty, that no tropical cyclone could ever do serious damage to Galveston. He liked the word tropical cyclone over hurricane because it was much more scientific. But he argued that no tropical cyclone could ever do serious damage to Galveston, and then went on to explain why, an incredibly contorted explanation. And then in the end, he said anybody who believed otherwise, who believed that a tropical cyclone could in fact damage Galveston, was the victim of, as he put it, an absurd delusion. And right there in that phrase, that expressed the hubris of the day. To say that it was an absurd delusion. It was just a little bit over the top. And that quality of being over the top kind of characterized the day. Thankfully. I mean, it was a very interesting time. This is the period when we were about ready to take over the work on the Panama Canal, at which, the French had failed absolutely miserably. And yet they had Eiffel himself, the most famous engineer of the 19th century, doing the project. And here we thought, hey, here we are. Okay, you guys bombed. We're going to do it in a heartbeat. And you know what? We kind of did. Not a heartbeat exactly, but it was that attitude that said, hey, we can do anything. And in some cases, it got us into trouble. In some cases, not.
How has writing this book changed your own view of weather?
I'm not sure it has changed my own view of weather. If anything, it has reinforced my own sense that nature can do anything it damn pleases. And we can say that there's no global warming, and we can say that, the ozone hole over the Arctic maybe doesn't mean anything. But I guess what I've always felt is that nature can do anything it wants and is still full of surprises and will surprise us yet again over and over.
Did you see any parallels in terms of the extremes of weather patterns at the end of the last century and the ones that we're experiencing at the beginning of the 21st century?
Yeah, there were some kind of eerie parallels. I mean, there was this matter of extreme heat, much more transient back in 1900, but there were some odd phenomena. The Bering Glacier in Alaska apparently had for the first time begun to move rather rapidly, indicating a significant melting, and it was calving big icebergs, and rivers were flowing from it, so forth. And that kind of phenomena had calmed down for much of the 20th century and only really began to reactivate recently. So there was that parallel. There were some sort of, again, more transient parallels in terms of, even just last summer. We had a quite active hurricane season after a period of intense summer heat. And many people who read my book drew parallels to what happened in 1900. Now, I don't think those are valid parallels, frankly. I question any kind of short-term parallel when it has to do with weather. Weather is what you call a mesoscale phenomenon. You can only really look at it over hundreds of years to see real patterns. And frankly, we just don't have those records.
Right. In the days of the hurricane in Galveston, there was no such thing as grief counselors.
Right.
How did people cope with what happened to them?
Well, one of the things I found very striking is that the historical record, and you can't go beyond ultimately what the historical record tells you, was that there was surprisingly little on the emotional impact of the storm. There were, as you point out, there were no grief counselors who left elaborate memoranda or did studies or reports to say how everybody coped. But I think part of that is because this is maybe the brighter side of this hubris of the age, there was the sense that, we've been through this awful thing and we're going to persevere. We're not going to let this beat us. So there was that. There was this kind of sense that something really awful had happened, but now we're going to overcome it. And it kind of galvanized the community. Also, there was community. This was, the age of community before television and the internet and the fragmentation that all those things brought. People relied on each other. They knew each other. They helped each other. And I think this kind of sense of shared grief, nobody had to talk about it with each other because everybody shared it. Nearly everybody had lost somebody or knew somebody who did. That may have been a factor. But you see tantalizing glimpses, some of which I did not get into the book, of how the city emotionally, how people were affected by this afterwards. Frankly, one manifestation of this is simply the number of first-person accounts in the Rosenberg Library and the sheer emotional power of those accounts. It's almost as if they poured this grief, this latent grief, into these accounts. But in one particular case, I came across an account where a woman was describing how every year, initially the first year, every Sunday evening, she and her husband and some others from Galveston would get together for dinner and begin singing songs around the piano and inevitably be reduced to tears just by the memory of the storm and so forth. These were kind of like impromptu grief counseling sessions just among themselves each Sunday evening for dinner. And, each anniversary thereafter, they would gather and play these songs and talk and have dinner, and inevitably the sorrow would just become overwhelming. So you have that sense. But we've lost track of a lot of people from that time. I mean, many, many people simply left Galveston for good, and history is absolutely silent on those people.
And does the city or community of Galveston today in any way continue to commemorate the disaster?
Well, one of the things that I found very surprising, and to some extent it's been addressed and will be addressed, but it is almost as if the hurricane did so much damage to Galveston and to its psyche and to its fortunes and its future that the city tried to put the whole thing behind it, not really acknowledge it. I mean, for example, until now, there has not been a monument to the storm in Galveston, nothing to commemorate the 10,000 dead. There is a gigantic Texas Heroes Monument about, the great heroes of Texas, the wars and so forth. But there is nothing that commemorates the loss of life, the 10,000 lives. To some extent, that's being addressed in the 2000 anniversary commemoration of the storm. There is going to be at last a large monument built. But I was really struck by the fact that there was nothing really until now, over 100 years. It's almost as if the wound was just too great.
Well, it's like the way they paved over the streets to make it higher, and you have that in your book about how the dead were finally in place or something to that effect.
Yeah, one of the things that, clearly that was not an effort to bury the storm, but metaphorically it did. One could almost, if one were a poet, one could see the razing of the city and the burial of the old Galveston as kind of a metaphor for how the city has treated the storm to date. But again, they're trying to address that now.
Well, let's spend the last few moments, if we can, learning a little bit about you as a writer and your beginnings as a writer. How did you become a writer?
I have always wanted to write. I was in high school. I was writing detective novels, which of course were never published, but I had fantasies that they would be. I mean, I always loved to write. And throughout high school, throughout college, I was always had some project, some writing project going. I mean, all incredibly naive, I have to say, but always something going. I did convince myself in college that I really had to get a life first and write on the side, so I actually considered going to law school. And then just to kind of test that idea, I took a business law course. This was a notoriously tough course at the University of Pennsylvania that undergraduates could take. And after 3 days, I realized I simply could not stand to read a law book and abandoned my future career in that instant. But then, after college, I went to worked in publishing because, I thought, hey, this kind of puts me close to writing. Of course, I was so wrong. I mean, I was a gopher, is what they call an assistant editor, which means essentially that you assist your editor in getting coffee in the morning. And even when I was promoted to a notch or so above that, I realized that there's no glamour in publishing, and there's not much writing unless you get up to really exalted levels. And then, serendipity is something that I rely on in my career and have always relied on. It's like if you put yourself in the way of luck, luck will meet you. And I decided about a year into that, first of all, I made the mistake of seeing All the President's Men, that wonderful movie when it first came out. And I thought, wow, now I could do that. That sounds interesting to me. I could do investigative projects and bring down the White House. That'd be cool. And so I told myself, okay, I'm going to kind of let fate take a hand here. I'm going to apply to one journalism school, the best school, and I considered that to be Columbia. And if I get in, that's fate saying, okay, you're destined to do this. And if I don't, well, I'm going to go to Europe for, a few months, travel around, and then decide what to do. Well, I got in. And then, the rest was kind of, got into journalism and so forth. And always, kind of close to writing, but not really real writing. And then finally, now that I'm in my 40s, I realized, hey, that clock is ticking. And I just realized it's time to do some real writing. And so that's what I'm doing.
Well, what are you working on now?
Well, I do have my next project underway, but maybe I'm betraying too much of my deeply superstitious nature, but I don't like to talk about projects until they're done. But it will be a historical narrative, however, and it's going to be the same kind of mining of fact from history. And I will say this, that there will be a serial killer, a real live serial killer in this book. This will be a guy who actually existed back in the Victorian era.
Oh my, well gosh, I'm sure people are getting out their crossword puzzles and trying to figure out who it is. It's not, his initials aren't JTR, are they?
It is not Jack the Ripper.
Oh, okay, all right.
One of the beauties, though, is that it too will be somebody who should be well known now, but who is not.
Well, no, it's wonderful to sort of discover a person that you've never heard of before. There's a great delight in that as a reader and a listener. So a couple more questions. I always like to ask this. What is a day like in the life of Erik Larson, author, journalist, and novelist?
Well, let's see. When I'm writing, like in the final phases of Isaac Storm, when I was writing and researching kind of simultaneously and kind of chugging toward that deadline, what I like to do is I like to get up early. I'm up at 4 o'clock and get some coffee and sit down and I write till about 7. That's my best time of day is from 4 to 7 in the morning. And then I come down and pal around with the kids, help with breakfast. We make lunches and ferry the kids to their various schools. And then I come back right till about noon or 1. And then I use the afternoons to polish up details, do correspondence, do some more research, that kind of stuff. And then that's pretty much the day.
What time does a person go to bed in order to get up at 4 in the morning?
I usually go to bed about 9:30 or 10. I find in the evening, especially with 3 kids, 3 energetic daughters, that by the time they go to bed, I have absolutely nothing left.
I'm sure.
I just gotta, I'm lucky if I can get to the eldest's bedtime intact.
Good. Now, the final question is, if one of our listeners had an idea or wanted to write an historical novel, what advice could you give them?
Well, I think the most important advice is there has to be a story and you have to have a character or 2, central characters, through whom you can tell the story. Too often people will set out to write works on history, be they fiction or nonfiction, and become so engrossed in the details that they forget that to make these interesting to a reader, you have to tie them together with something coherent and something inherently compelling, both on an intellectual and an emotional level, and that's character. Very, very important. If you don't have that, you don't have a book.
All right. Any final thoughts?
Well, I would say, again, addressing the idea of people who want to go out and do books, I would say, take a shot at it. Start it now, because there's never going to be a better time. And, something I've always said to myself is, hey, if not me, then who?
Great. Well, it's just a wonderful book, Isaac Storm, reading it, listening to it, and you're just an extraordinary writer. And we want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me.
All right. We look forward to your next book, Eric.
Thanks.
Author Eric Larson and recorded book staffer Denise Langto talking about the writing of Isaac Storm. Recorded Books is pleased to offer an unabridged recording of Isaac's